There's a color that no farmer ever wants to see on his ground. It's not the brown of drought. Drought is temporary, and rain cures it. It's not the gray of erosion. Erosion is slow, and good farming can reverse it. The color no farmer wants to see is white. White on the surface of the soil, white crust, white powder, white crystals that glitter in the sun like frost but don't melt when the temperature rises. Salt. When you see white on your ground, the ground is dying. And in most cases, in most places, according to most experts, throughout most of agricultural history, once the salt comes, the land is finished. This is the story of a man who disagreed. Stafford County sits in the south-central part of Kansas, about 60 miles west of Wichita. It's flat, dry, windy country. The kind of land where you can see a thunderstorm 40 miles away and still not get a drop of rain. Average annual rainfall about 22 inches, which is barely enough to grow dryland wheat. For 100 years, the farmers of Stafford County grew wheat and sorghum and prayed for rain and accepted whatever the sky gave them. Then, in the late 1950s, the government brought irrigation. It came through the Bureau of Reclamation, the same agency that had dammed the Colorado River and turned the California desert green. The plan for Stafford County was simpler, but no less ambitious. Divert water from the Arkansas River and the underlying High Plains aquifer through a network of canals and pump stations, delivering it to farms across the southern part of the county. The farmers would install center pivot sprinklers and flood irrigation systems, and the dry prairie would bloom. It worked. For about 10 years, it worked brilliantly. Dryland wheat that had yielded 20 to 25 bushels per acre suddenly yielded 60, 70, 80 bushels under irrigation. Farmers planted corn for the first time, 120 bushels on ground that had never seen corn before. Alfalfa, soybeans, crops that needed water, growing in a place where water had always been scarce. Land values doubled, then tripled. Farmers borrowed against the rising value to install more pivots, buy more equipment, plant more acres. The J.D. dealership in Stafford, run by a man named Dwayne Phelps, who had the moral certainty of a man who sells solutions, reported his best decade ever. Everyone was happy. Everyone was irrigating. Everyone was winning, except the soil. Let me explain what was happening beneath the surface, because the science is the skeleton of this story. The Arkansas River water that fed the irrigation system wasn't pure. No river water is. It carried dissolved minerals, calcium, magnesium, sodium, chloride, sulfate, picked up from the geological formations the river passed through on its way across western Kansas. The concentrations were low enough that the water was fine for irrigation. In the short term, but every time a farmer irrigated, the water soaked into the soil, the crops absorbed what they needed, and the rest evaporated. When water evaporates, the minerals don't go with it. They stay in the soil. Every irrigation cycle left a tiny deposit of salt in the ground, invisible at first, undetectable in a soil test for years, but accumulating, slowly, steadily, the way snow accumulates on a roof until the day the roof collapses. At the same time, the heavy irrigation was raising the water table. In southern Stafford County, the natural water table sat about 40 feet below the surface, deep enough that capillary action couldn't pull it to the root zone. But 10 years of pumping river water onto the fields had raised the table to 15 feet, then 12, then 8. When the water table rises that high, something terrible happens. The moisture in the soil connects to the water below through capillary action, the same force that makes water climb up a paper towel. The underground water, which contains its own load of dissolved minerals from millennia of slow dissolution through ancient seabeds, begins to rise toward the surface. And when it reaches the surface, it evaporates, leaving its mineral cargo behind. Salt. On the surface. Visible. White. The first white patches appeared in Stafford County in 1967. A few acres here and there, in the low spots where water collected. Nobody worried. Mineral deposits, the county agent said, normal in irrigated areas. It'll wash through with the next heavy rain. It didn't wash through. It got worse. By 1970, the white patches had expanded. Entire fields had a pale crust that crunched underfoot. Crops planted in the affected areas germinated, grew 3 or 4 inches, turned yellow, and died. The salt was pulling water out of the roots faster than the roots could absorb it. Osmotic stress, the agronomists called it. In plain language, the soil was poisoning the crop. By 1972, over 1,500 acres in southern Stafford County were visibly salt damaged. Yields on the affected ground had dropped from 80 bushels to 40, then to 20, then to nothing. Some fields looked like a snow-covered parking lot in July. White, flat, dead. The farmers panicked. They called the extension agent. They called the Bureau of Reclamation. They called the university. Everyone said the same thing. Leach the salts. Apply more water to flush the minerals down through the soil profile and into the drainage. There was one problem. There was no drainage. The Bureau of Reclamation had designed an irrigation delivery system but not a drainage system. The water came in, but it had nowhere to go out. The salts were trapped. The more water you applied, the higher the water table rose, the more salt came to the surface. It was a perfect trap. The cure was the cause. By 1975, the exodus had begun. Farmers in the worst affected zone, a band about 3 miles wide and 8 miles long in the southern part of the county, started selling their land. Not for what it was worth. For whatever they could get. Land that had sold for $400 an acre in '68 was going for $50 and $75. Some parcels couldn't sell at any price. Over 3,000 acres were abandoned between '75 and '78. Abandoned, not sold, not converted, not repurposed, just left. The farmers walked away. The houses emptied. The equipment was hauled to other farms or left to rust. The center pivots stood like skeletons over white ground. The county agent, a man named Roland Friesen, drove through the abandoned zone in the fall of '76 and wrote a report for the state extension office. The report included a sentence that became locally famous. The salinization of southern Stafford County represents an irreversible loss of productive agricultural land. No economically viable remediation exists for soil with this degree of salt accumulation. Irreversible. No remediation. The land was dead, and the experts said it would stay dead. Every farmer left. Every farmer except one. Vernon Schrag was 57 years old and had farmed 320 acres in the middle of the salt zone since 1946, the year he came home from the Pacific and married Helen Kane, whose father owned the land. Vernon had farmed it dry land for 12 years before the irrigation came, and he'd continued farming it with irrigation after reluctantly, because Vernon had the same distrust of government water that Alvin Drucker had, although the two men never knew each other. When the salt appeared on Vernon's ground, first a few patches in '70, then spreading across his lower fields like a slow white tide, Vernon did what he always did when something went wrong. He studied it. He didn't call the extension agent. He didn't call the university. He went to the Stafford Public Library, the same way Boyd Ellsworth went to the California-Missouri Library when his topsoil washed away. Vernon checked out every book and bulletin the library had about soil salinity, 3 pamphlets and a textbook chapter from a 1954 agronomy manual. He read them in 2 nights. Then he drove to Wichita and spent a day at the Wichita State University Library, reading journal articles about salinization in irrigated regions, Iraq, Egypt, Pakistan, Australia, countries that had been dealing with salt for centuries longer than Kansas. What Vernon learned was this: the conventional approach to salinization was to fight the salt directly, flush it out with water, apply chemical amendments like gypsum to displace sodium, install drainage to carry the salty water away. These methods worked, but they were expensive. They required infrastructure that Stafford County didn't have, and they treated the symptom without changing the system. But Vernon found something else in the literature, something from Australia, where dryland farmers had dealt with rising salinity for decades. A handful of Australian researchers had experimented with a different approach. Instead of trying to remove the salt from the existing soil, they built a new root zone on top of it. The concept was simple. If the salt was in the top 6 to 12 inches of soil and you couldn't afford to remove it, you could bury it, cover it with a thick layer of organic material that would over time create a new soil layer above the salt. The roots of crops would grow in the organic layer above the salt zone, drawing moisture from rain rather than from the contaminated water table below. It wasn't fast, it wasn't easy, and nobody in Kansas had ever tried it. Vernon started in the fall of 1975 on his worst field, a 40-acre piece in the lowest part of his farm, where the salt crust was 3/4 of an inch thick, and nothing had grown in 2 years. He began hauling organic material, straw first. Vernon drove his farm all 560 to every wheat field in the county that had been harvested and asked the farmers if he could have their straw. Most said yes. Straw was a byproduct, often burned or plowed under. Vernon baled it and hauled it to his salt field, spreading it 8 inches deep across the entire 40 acres. Then manure. He made a deal with a cattle feedlot operator 12 miles north. He would haul the feedlot's accumulated manure for free. The feedlot was happy to get rid of it. Vernon hauled for 3 weeks straight, piling cattle manure on top of the straw layer until the combined depth was 14 to 16 inches. Then more straw on top of the manure, as a cover layer to reduce evaporation and protect the decomposing material beneath. The neighbors watched this with a mixture of pity and bewilderment. "Vernon Schrag is putting straw on salt," they said at the co-op. "He might as well put frosting on a rock." Dwayne Phelps, the JD dealer, was less gentle. "Vernon's lost it," Dwayne said. "That ground is dead. The extension agent said so. The university said so. You can't grow a crop on salt by putting garbage on top of it. He's wasting his time, wasting his straw, and wasting what's left of his money on a field that will never produce another bushel." Roland Friesen, the extension agent, drove out to Vernon's farm in November of '75. He stood at the edge of the 40-acre field and looked at the layers of straw and manure covering the white salt. "Vernon," Roland said, carefully, professionally, "I understand what you're trying to do, but the salt concentration in this soil is over 8 decisiemens per meter. That's 4 times the threshold for wheat. Even if you build an organic layer on top, the capillary action will pull salt up through it within 2 seasons. Vernon looked at Roland. "How deep does capillary action pull salt in a mineral soil?" 6 to 12 inches, depending on soil texture. "And in organic material, decomposed straw and manure?" Roland paused. "Organic material has a different capillary structure than mineral soil. The pores are larger, the pathways are more irregular, the wicking action is weaker." "Less," Roland admitted. "Maybe 4 to 6 inches in well-decomposed organic matter. So if I build an organic layer 18 inches deep, the salt can only rise 4 to 6 inches into it from below. That leaves 12 inches of clean root zone on top." Roland opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "In theory. But Vernon, 18 inches of organic matter over 40 acres is, I don't even know how to calculate that. It's thousands of tons. Where are you going to get thousands of tons of organic material?" "Same place it always comes from," Vernon said. "Other people's waste." That first winter, 75 into 76, Vernon laid down the base layer on the 40 acres and let it sit. He didn't plant anything. He let the straw and manure decompose over the winter and spring, breaking down, composting in place, turning from raw material into something darker, denser, more soil-like. In the spring of '76, he added more, another round of straw from the previous year's wheat harvest, more feedlot manure, a load of spoiled hay from a dairy operation in Reno County, hay that was too moldy to feed to cattle but perfect for decomposition. He piled it on. The layer grew to 18 inches, then 20. He didn't plant in '76 either. He was building. Patience. In the fall of '76, Vernon did something that nobody understood. He planted a cover crop, not wheat, not sorghum, not anything he intended to harvest, He planted rye, winter rye, drilled straight through the decomposing organic layer into whatever lay beneath. The rye was a test. If roots could penetrate the organic layer and survive without hitting lethal salt concentrations, the concept worked. If the rye died, Vernon would know the capillary action was pulling salt higher than he'd hoped. The rye came up in October, thin at first, pale green shoots emerging through the dark brown surface of decomposed straw and manure. Vernon watched it every day, walking the field in the early morning, looking for the yellowing that would signal salt damage. The yellowing didn't come. The rye grew. Slowly. This wasn't normal ground, and the root zone was unusual, but it grew. By December, the field had a thin green cover. The roots, when Vernon carefully dug up a plant and examined them, extended 9 inches into the organic layer. They had not reached the salt zone below. Vernon stood in that field on a December morning with a rye plant in his hand, its roots dangling clean and white, and he knew the science worked. The organic layer was blocking the salt. The capillary bridge had been broken. The roots were growing in clean material above the contamination, and the salt was still there. It hadn't gone anywhere, but it was buried, sealed, irrelevant to the plants growing above it. He'd built new soil on top of dead soil, and the new soil was alive. He told nobody. Not yet. One season of rye was a test, not a proof. He needed years. 77. Vernon plowed the rye under, adding its roots and stalks to the organic layer, and planted wheat. Real wheat. The kind you harvest and sell. The wheat grew. Not spectacularly, 31 bushels per acre, below the county average of 42 on normal ground, but 31 bushels on ground that Roland Friesen had declared irreversibly dead. 31 bushels where the number had been 0 for 3 years. Vernon sold the wheat, pocketed the income, and added more organic material to the field after harvest. Always adding, always building. 78, 44 bushels. The organic layer was maturing. The decomposition was creating humus, stable organic matter that held moisture, supported microbial life, and provided nutrients. The root zone was deepening as the layer thickened. Vernon was no longer just covering the salt. He was creating an entirely new soil profile that had nothing to do with the dead ground beneath it. 79, 48 bushels, above the county average for dryland wheat. Let me pause here and tell you what was happening on the other side of the fence. The 3,000 abandoned acres surrounding Vernon's farm were still white, still dead. The farmers who'd left hadn't come back. A few parcels had been bought by speculators for $50 an acre, hoping the government would eventually fund a drainage project. The government never did. The speculators wrote off the investment. The land sat empty. Vernon's 320 acres, the green island in the White Sea, became visible from the air. A pilot flying crop dusting runs in the summer of 79 looked down and saw what looked like an error in the landscape. A rectangle of growing wheat surrounded on all sides by white salt flats. He mentioned it at the airfield. The story spread. By 1980, Vernon had converted all 320 acres to his organic layer system. Not all at once, 40 acres at a time, rotating through the farm over 5 years, building the organic layer on each field in sequence. His total investment in materials was almost nothing. Straw was free. Manure was free. Spoiled hay was free. His investment in labor was enormous. Thousands of hours of hauling, spreading, managing decomposition. But labor was the one thing Vernon had that cost nothing. It was his own time, spent on his own land, building something that nobody else believed in. In the fall of '80, the County Extension Service sent a new agent, a younger man named Dale Wenger, who had replaced Roland Friesen, to visit Vernon's farm. Dale had heard the stories. He'd seen the aerial photographs. He came with a soil probe and a skeptic's notebook. Vernon took him to the original 40-acre field, the one that had been dead white salt 5 years earlier. Dale pushed the probe in. The core showed 18 inches of dark, decomposed organic material. Rich, moist, alive with root channels and earthworm holes, sitting directly on top of a layer of pale, salt-crusted mineral soil. The boundary between the two was sharp, like a layer cake, dark on top, white below. "This is extraordinary," Dale said. "You've essentially built an artificial soil profile." "Nothing artificial about it," Vernon said. "It's straw, manure, rye roots, and thyme. That's soil. The only thing artificial about this field is the salt that the government put here." Dale tested the organic layer for salinity. The reading was 1.2 decisiements per meter, well within the safe range for wheat. He tested the mineral soil beneath it, 8.4 decisiements, still fatally saline. "The salt hasn't moved," Dale said. "It's still right there." "Of course it's still there," Vernon said. "I didn't fix the salt, I buried it. The crops don't know it's down there. The roots don't reach it. The water comes from rain, not from the water table. As long as I keep adding organic matter and keep the layer deep enough, the salt is irrelevant." Dale published his findings in a Kansas State Extension bulletin in 1981. The title was Organic Layer Soil Building on Salinized Ground, a 5-year case study in Stafford County. It was the first published documentation of Vernon's method. The bulletin got attention. Not from the farmers who'd left, most of them had moved on, mentally and physically, but from soil scientists, extension agents in other salt-affected regions, and a handful of farmers in neighboring counties who had their own salinization problems and were looking for solutions that didn't cost $100,000 in drainage infrastructure. A soil scientist from Kansas State University drove down to Vernon's farm in the spring of '82. He spent 3 days taking samples, measuring root depths, testing salinity gradients at different levels of the organic layer. His data confirmed what Vernon had been saying for 7 years. The organic layer functioned as a completely independent soil system, physically and chemically isolated from the saline ground beneath it by the weak capillary properties of decomposed organic material. "Mr. Schrag," the scientist said, "what you've done here contradicts every recommendation the Extension Service has made about salinized land for the past 30 years. We've been telling farmers to flush, amend, and drain. You've demonstrated that covering and building is at least as effective and dramatically cheaper." "I didn't contradict anything," Vernon said. "I just asked a different question. Everyone else asked, 'How do we fix the salt?' I asked, 'How do we ignore it?'" Now let me tell you about Dwayne Phelps, because the story isn't complete without the man who laughed loudest. Dwayne's John Deere dealership survived the '70s, but the salinization crisis had hurt him. Fewer farmers, less equipment sales, a shrinking customer base. When the farm crisis hit in '82 on top of the salt problem, Dwayne was squeezed from both directions. He closed the dealership in '84, moved to Wichita, took a job selling industrial equipment. In the summer of '85, Dwayne drove back to Stafford County to visit his brother, who still lived in town. He drove past the salt zone on his way in. He stopped the car. The abandoned farms were still abandoned. The white salt flats still stretched in every direction. But in the middle of it, visible from the county road, impossible to miss, Vernon Schrag's 320 acres were green. Not just green, dark green. Healthy wheat, standing thick and even, on ground that 10 years earlier had been as white and dead as a bleached bone. Dwayne sat in his car and stared for a long time. Then he drove to Vernon's farm. Vernon was in his barn, sharpening a sickle blade. He looked up when Dwayne walked in. "Dwayne." "Vernon." They hadn't spoken in years. Dwayne looked around the barn. The same farmall, the same tools. Nothing had changed except everything. "How did you do it?" Dwayne asked. "Straw and manure," Vernon said. 8 years of straw and manure. "That's it?" "That's it, plus patience. But nobody sells patience at a dealership, so I had to supply my own." Dwayne was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Vernon had waited 10 years to hear. Not because he needed vindication, but because it meant the lesson had been learned. "I told everyone you were wasting your time," Dwayne said. "I said the ground was dead. I said you couldn't grow on salt by putting garbage on top of it. You did say that. I was wrong. You were. How did you know? How did you know it would work when every expert said it wouldn't? Vernon set down the sickle blade and leaned against the workbench. I didn't know it would work. I knew the experts were answering the wrong question. They were trying to remove the salt. I wasn't trying to remove anything. I was trying to build something. Building is easier than removing. It's slower, but it's cheaper, and it doesn't depend on anyone but you. He picked up a handful of soil from a bucket on the bench. Dark, rich, crumbling, soil he'd built from waste on ground that was supposed to be dead. This soil didn't exist 10 years ago. It's not the ground's original topsoil. That's still there, underneath, full of salt. This is new soil. I made it, from things that nobody wanted. Straw that would have been burned. Manure that would have been a disposal problem. Spoiled hay that would have gone to the dump. I took what people threw away and turned it into the only productive ground in this part of the county. He put the soil back in the bucket. The salt is still down there, Dwayne. It hasn't moved. It's not going anywhere. But neither am I. Let me tell you about the end. Because Vernon Schrag's story doesn't end with one farm. Vernon farmed until 1994. He was 76. He'd spent 19 years building organic soil profiles on salinized ground, and his 320 acres were producing consistently above county average on land that the Extension Service had declared irreversibly dead in 1976. His son Lauren took over the farm and the method. Lauren had grown up hauling straw and manure. It was the family business, the endless chore that defined life on the Schrag farm. He knew the system not from reading about it, but from living it. Every fall, more organic material. Every spring, deeper roots. Every year, better soil. By 2000, the Kansas State Extension Service had revised its recommendations for salinized land in western Kansas. The new guidelines included for the first time a section on organic layer building as an alternative to drainage and chemical amendment. The section cited Vernon Schrag's farm as the primary case study. 2 other farmers in Stafford County adopted Vernon's method in the 90s, applying organic layers to portions of the abandoned salt flats. Their results confirmed what Vernon had demonstrated. If you build the layer thick enough and maintain it with annual additions, crops will grow on top of salinized ground that is, by every conventional measure, dead. The 3,000 abandoned acres are mostly still abandoned. The white salt is still there. The houses are still empty. The pivots still stand like skeletons. But in the middle of it, Vernon Schrag's 320 acres and the 2 neighboring farms that followed his method are green, an island of life in a sea of white. Vernon died in 2004, at 77. His funeral was in the Mennonite church in Stafford, a small service, because Vernon had been a quiet man who didn't collect friends any more than he collected debt. But the soil scientists came. Dale Wenger came. 3 farmers from other counties who had adapted Vernon's method came, and Lauren stood in the church and said one thing about his father that captured everything. My father was told the land was dead. He said it wasn't. He was told there was no remedy. He said there was. He was told he was wasting his time. He said time was the one thing he had, and he was right about all of it. Lauren still farms the 320 acres. His daughter Megan joined him in 2018. The organic layer on the original 40-acre field, the first one Vernon treated in 75, is now over 24 inches deep. The salt beneath it hasn't moved. The wheat above it yields 52 bushels per acre. And every fall after harvest, the Schrags haul straw and manure to the fields and add another layer. Not because they have to. 24 inches of organic soil is more than enough. But because Vernon taught them that soil isn't something you finish building. It's something you never stop building. Because the moment you stop, the salt starts to win. Sometimes the land that everyone abandons is the land that teaches the most. Sometimes the answer to a poison isn't an antidote, it's a blanket. And sometimes the man who stays when everyone leaves is the man who understands something the experts missed. You don't have to fix what's broken if you can build something new on top of it. Vernon Schrag built soil from waste on ground that was supposed to be dead. He did it with straw and manure and patience and the stubborn refusal to accept that an expert's verdict is the same thing as the truth. The salt is still there, the wheat is still growing, and the shrags are still hauling.